In the summer of 1914, a single spark in Sarajevo set the world on fire. What followed was a catastrophe that defied human imagination. They called it the Great War, a global collision of empires that began in July 1914 and wouldn't fall silent until November 1918. By the time the guns finally stopped, 4 empires had vanished, and over 20 million people were dead. It was the birth of industrial slaughter, a world of chemical gas and a jagged scar of trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. But by 1916, the war had stalled. The war of movement was a memory. The generals were desperate. On the German side, Erich von Falkenhayn looked at a map and circled a small fortified town in France, a place of history, a place of pride, Verdun. His goal wasn't to capture it. It was more sinister. To bleed France white. He believed that if he attacked Verdun, France would throw every last man into the fire to defend it, and he would simply sit back and let his artillery erase them from existence. He called his plan Gericht, the place of judgment. On the morning of February 21, 1916, the judgment began. The air at Verdun didn't just vibrate, it shattered. For 9 hours, 1,200 German guns vomited 1 million shells into a tiny patch of French soil. This was Trommelfeuer drum fire. The explosions were so frequent they sounded like a single, continuous roar. When the heavy shells hit, they didn't just kill. They obliterated. The pressure waves were so violent they could collapse a soldier's lungs without leaving a single scratch on his skin. Entire hillsides were reshaped. Forests were turned into splintered toothpicks in a matter of minutes. Then, out of the smoke, came the German stormtroopers wielding the Flammenwerfer, the flamethrower. They sprayed liquid fire into the bunkers, turning defensive works into ovens. The French front lines didn't just break. They evaporated into ash and screams. In those first few days, the Germans advanced miles, and it looked as though the French army was facing total annihilation. But France refused to die. Under the command of Philippe Pétain, the French realized that if they couldn't stop the artillery, they would have to outsupply it. They created the Voie Sacrée, the sacred way. It was a single, narrow dirt road that became the lifeline of the nation. 6,000 trucks moved along this road every day, one every 14 seconds. If a truck broke down, it was shoved into the ditch. There was no time for repairs. To keep the men from losing their minds, Pétain instituted the Noria system. Instead of keeping the same units in the line until they were destroyed, he rotated them. A division would spend 2 weeks in the hell of Verdun and then be pulled back. Because of this, eventually, almost every single soldier in the French army, 3/4 of the entire military, passed through the fires of Verdun. They all shared the same trauma. They all saw the same nightmare. By the summer, the meat grinder was in full swing. Because of the constant shelling, the trenches were blown away, leaving men to huddle in shell craters filled with freezing green water. To walk through Verdun was to walk through a graveyard that refused to stay buried. The earth was turned over like a farmer's field, unearthing the stiffened remains of those who had fallen weeks before. The air was a heavy metallic soup of rot, stale cordite, and the stinging bite of mustard gas that lingered in the low hollows like a ghost. Soldiers spoke of the living dead, men who had spent days under bombardment, their eyes glazed with a 1,000-yard stare, their skin caked in a layer of gray mud that made them look like statues. They shared their meager rations with rats that grew fat on the fallen, and they drank water from puddles that were slick with oil and blood. It was no longer a war of strategy. It was a test of who could endure being broken the longest. The fighting eventually moved into the massive concrete bunkers, Fort Douaumont and Fort Vaux. Inside, the war became primitive and claustrophobic. The tunnels were dark, cramped, and filled with the smoke of grenades. Soldiers fought with knives, shovels, and bayonets in pitch-black corridors where the only light came from the flash of a pistol. At Fort Vaux, the French were completely cut off. The heat was unbearable and the water supplies were exhausted. Men were reduced to licking the slime and condensation off the walls just to keep their tongues from swelling. When the commander finally surrendered, his men were so dehydrated they could barely stand. They were heroes of a subterranean hell. By December 1916, the French had clawed back their lost ground. and the German offensive finally collapsed under the weight of its own casualties. The place of judgment had claimed over 700,000 casualties. Today, the landscape is still deformed. If you visit Verdun, the ground isn't flat. It is covered in ripples, millions of overlapping shell craters that nature has tried to hide with grass. There are red zones, where the soil is so saturated with lead, arsenic, and unexploded chemicals that it remains illegal to walk there a century later. In the Douaumont ossuary, small windows reveal a chilling sight. The tangled bones of 130,000 unidentified soldiers, French and German, lying together in the dark. In death, they finally found the peace that the world denied them in 1916. Verdun didn't end the war, but it ended the world as those men knew it. It remains a monument to the terrifying price of human pride. When the smoke finally cleared over the Meuse River in December 1916, the world looked different. The Battle of Verdun wasn't just another engagement. It was a turning point that reshaped the future of human conflict. First, it proved that the war of attrition was a mathematical nightmare. Germany's plan to bleed the enemy dry backfired, costing them nearly as many lives as the French. This failure eventually forced the German high command to turn toward unrestricted submarine warfare to break the British blockade, a move that would ultimately draw the United States into the war and seal Germany's fate. For France, Verdun became a holy scar. The trauma of losing so many men in a static defense led them to build the infamous Maginot Line in the 1930s. They became obsessed with the Verdun mindset, believing that massive concrete forts and defensive endurance were the only way to survive. It was a lesson learned in 1916 that would tragically leave them unprepared for the fast-moving blitzkrieg of 1940. But perhaps the deepest repercussion was psychological. Verdun was where shell shock, what we now call PTSD, became an undeniable epidemic. It was the moment humanity realized that industrial warfare didn't just break bodies. It shattered the human soul. The romanticized view of war as a noble adventure died in the mud of the Douaumont woods. In the end, Verdun remains the ultimate testament to the sunk cost fallacy. Both sides poured hundreds of thousands of lives into a few square miles of worthless, charred earth, simply because they had already lost too much to stop. It stands today as a warning. It tells us that when war becomes an industry, the only product is the grave. As the grass grows over the craters and the bones turn to dust in the ossuary, the silence of Verdun speaks louder than the roar of its guns ever did. Never again.